Brian here, I'll let him introduce himself, but he's going to talk about libraries and frameworks. So you know how previously I mentioned that you don't want to reinvent the wheel, you want to make use of other people's code? This is how you do it. So pay attention. I guess things escalate quickly compared to this morning. So yeah, enjoy. It's yours.
All right, hey everyone. So hope you guys had lunch. Hope you're well fed. Because in this section, we'll actually be looking into a few ways to save you time, right? So let's do some maths first, actually. Are you all ready? Yeah? OK. Maths. If you guys remember f of x, 2x plus 1? Yeah? No? Maybe? All right, so imagine you're in an exam, right? And you have to create a table of values for a specific equation, right? And if you had your calculator, instead of typing up 2 times 0 plus 1, 2 times 1 plus 1, 2 times 2 plus 1, right? You could instead make a function on your calculator, like at the top there, 2x plus 1, and then just change the variable that actually changes, x, right? Because 2 remains the same, 1 remains the same, right? So that in itself is a sort of like pure function in maths. And it's kind of the same way as what your functions in your code would do, right? It'll save you having to rewrite all that for things that only change, let's say just one part changes, right? So again, this is your function in a sort of mathematical sense. But as you did earlier, I think using JavaScript, those were also some other functions, right? So in the background, the function calls actually does all these sort of like repetitive tasks that you would have had to manually type out in the past, right? Yeah? Maths? Yay. OK, so what is a library, right? This is a bit verbose, right? So it says a collection of implementations invoked through a defined interface. Yeah, no, basically you could view a library as a collection of, well, functions or objects or whatnot, right? That you call in a certain way, right? So if you have any language, you'll have a standard library there. Or if you have third-party libraries, there'll be a way for you to call them, right? So that sort of interface, you might have heard the term used, and I think we'll cover later on. The term is API, right? So it's application programming interface. So that's sort of interface. You use an API to interface with the library and your code, right? So it's just a collection of all that, the same way as you have like a toolbox, which is a collection of tools, and tools are there to make your life easier, right? Yeah? Everyone on the right track? Yeah? OK, so that's a library. And some examples in JavaScript for libraries you might have come across is jQuery at your top left. So what jQuery does is it's mostly there for DOM manipulation, right? So you have the document object model, and it's great for actually changing that around, moving things around, fading, and showing them up, So that's jQuery. _JS is great if you want to work with data. So if you wanted to sort, filter, reduce, map, all that, underscore is great. WinJS is a great library if you want to actually make modern apps using JavaScript. So if you don't really like C# or XAML, you could just use WinJS instead. It does the same sort of like modern apps. Backbone is there if you want to have like models and view for your actual front end. Backbone underscore and jQuery are also another combination that you could use. It will have the same sort of functionality as what you see later on. And also socket.io. That's if you wanted to make real-time applications. So if you wanted to make a sort of chat system, or if you wanted to make a web-based game, socket.io would actually do the sort of like real-time packets being sent to the client and the server. So those are examples of some JavaScript libraries. And if we now go to a framework. So again, this one is a bit more contentious. Like if you just search up a framework, you'll see lots of arguments as to what constitutes a framework and what's not a framework. And generally, you could just say that a framework is a generic architecture, right, with a default behavior. So with a framework, you're able to generally get it up and running without doing much changes, unlike a library, which is basically a shell on its own if you don't have code to actually call that library. Right? So that term there, inversion of control, you can basically think of it like a A library, right? Your code calls a library, whereas with a framework, it generally calls your code, right? So that's the sort of inversion of control. The framework is the one that actually directs the program flow, right? So this is not really a concrete definition. There's some frameworks that are more or less used as buzzwords. They're closer to a collection of libraries than they are to a pure like framework model. So some examples of that, Bootstrap. So we'll be using Bootstrap. There's also jQuery Mobile. So what jQuery Mobile is more or less like a combination of jQuery core with jQuery UI as well as some other fancy stuff. So it functions in a similar way to what you would have as AngularJS does, right? So it has the sort of like MVC sort of framework. And there's QUnit. So if you make your JavaScript code, you want to make sure that it actually runs as intended. So it's great for testing your code. And there's Meteor. So what Meteor does is it combines Socket.io and it combines some other like Vue frameworks like React or Angular, and it actually has a sort of like quick way for you to make real-time applications. So these are all frameworks. Although you could argue that Angular and Meteor are more of a framework than Bootstrap is, because it's a bit more loose and more permissive than Angular, which is very opinionated. So this is what we'll be using today, jQuery and Bootstrap. This is one of the most popular combinations on the web. So jQuery, pretty lightweight, it's about 32 kilobytes minified and zipped. Bootstrap, forgot the actual size, but Bootstrap was made by Twitter, or like the two people who more or less founded Twitter in order to make a sort of consistent design. And jQuery is there for you to easily change your DOM. So jQuery, DOM traversal manipulation, right? What that means is that it goes through your actual DOM, your document object model. It looks at your tags, your stylings, and all that in a sort of like object way. And it then does stuff to it. So it can like move it around, it can remove it, it can hide it, it can create new elements. It's really great for that. Probably even better than vanilla JS or the standard JavaScript. It's also cross-browser consistent, right? So some functions you might try to use in one browser might not necessarily work as well in another browser. So one of the prime examples for most developers is Internet Explorer, right? You make a code base for all the other browsers, but Internet Explorer just has to have its own thing going on, right? So what jQuery does is it sorts that out for you. And it's got a lot of plugins. So we'll show you some examples as well for jQuery. There are a lot of plugins out there by people that probably have more experience than we do. So instead of us trying to like tinker away and make something that's very bloated and inefficient, we can instead just use ready-made plugins and make our site rapidly usable. So this is the sort of document object model you see there. You see that there's the document up top, and then it just traverses down. You have each tag there as its own sort of like element. So jQuery more or less abstracts that for you, and you can immediately do that sort of like DOM traversal and make specific calls to specific elements that meet a specific criteria, which we'll show you later on. But yeah, so this is the sort of like DOM traversal and manipulation that it does. And if you look at the sort of comparison with plain JavaScript, you see one of them is more verbose than the other. So instead of having, strain injury from typing all that up, you can instead use $signs. So the $sign is more or less like it's equivalent to just calling the jQuery object. Of course, you could disable that if it's conflicting with other libraries. But basically, you can create elements, you can search for elements. So you see that you can search by ID. In jQuery, you can replace that hash sign with a dot if you wanted to search by class names, or you could just leave that empty if you wanted to search by the actual tag name. And you can add events, as you'll see later on. You can even change the stylings as well. So instead of having to actually go to your CSS files, you could just change it on the fly. It's pretty nifty if you have a big application and you don't have to go through 100 CSS files just to hide one element. So if I actually look at Tweet Alert, this is an example of one of the plugins. So it mostly prettifies your alert functions, right? So on your right side, you see that that's this sort of default Chrome alert. It's pretty bare bones. It's not really engaging for the user, and sometimes you might even miss it. Whereas Sweet Alert on the left, that's just one of the examples of the sort of error alert that they have. It's much more vibrant. It pops out more. It even has some really cool animations. So it captures your sort of audience, and it also like conveys information in a nice way, so they don't get as frustrated because it looks pretty. And if you look at FakeloaderJS, so this one basically, as your page loads, right, not everything will be able to be loaded instantly. So you could have a loader in the interim. So as it loads all the other, like, elements of your page, it'll just have that as a sort of like placeholder to overlay on top of your page. It's pretty cool, and it can also increase this sort of like tolerance that your actual users have for how long your website takes to load. So they won't, just exit it as, instantly. So yeah, it looks pretty cool, and it's quite easy to make. In fact, you could generally install it from Node as well. Might show you that later on. And then we move on to Bootstrap. So what Bootstrap does is it's mostly there for prettifying your website rapidly, right? So it's great if you want to make rapidly a responsive sort of website, right? So if you change the screen sizes on your phone, on your computers, or on your tablets, you can easily do that with Bootstrap, right? You don't have to worry about manually adjusting this sort of like margins and the sizings depending on what's browser or like what screen size is viewing it, right? So the aesthetic components is that it looks pretty. It looks nice. It looks, flash. And without you having to put in as much effort in the CSS, because it has CSS files and JavaScript files for you. And it's also cross-browser consistent. So it will more or less be the same across Firefox or across Chrome or across Opera or across Edge as well. And you don't have to worry about manually adjusting the margins for each different, rendering engine. So that's Bootstrap for you. And this is a great structure it does. So this is part of the whole responsive design. You can manually specify what sort of proportions that each element would take. So this is great if you wanted to have, let's say, a sort of like content part that is bigger on large screens, but halfway as big on smaller screens without having to like hide in all the other elements. So if you look on your bottom right, you have sort of like you can actually like specify if it's an extra small screen, what sort of like size to put. If it's a small screen, what sort of like size to put for that grid, what sort of like proportions that the actual website should take. And that more or less makes it usable on smaller devices as well as on larger ones. So you don't get those buttons that are really tiny on your 4K screen and really big on your iPhone or your Windows phone or your Android phone. And over on your bottom left side, you see the actual like syntax, right? So you have call for the column, and you have the size. So the size there is the actual like specifics there. So if it's XS or SM or MD or LG, right? So it specifies what to do when it comes across a sort of like viewport that's that size, right? And then on span is the actual like grid span. So generally you want to have it all add up to 12. You don't have to use all of the 12, but try to add it up to the 12. And that's how you would actually do it. You can actually combine combine multiple sort of like grid stylings. So you could have both XS and SM and MD and LG on the same sort of element. So it readjusts depending on what's being rendered. And if we move on to that, so these are just like combinations of some of this stuff that Bootstrap offers. So if you look at your top part, that's the sort of nav bar that's there for you. So the whole like, highlighting and the whole like, all that is already pre-made. You just have to change perhaps the links, perhaps the colors to your likings. And if you look on the mid-left section, those are the sort of alerts classes that it has. So if you can see that there's a certain pattern to it. There's success, which is the greenish, info, which is the sort of bluish, warning is more or less like an orange color, and then danger, which is the sort of red. And that's more or less consistent for their labels, for their buttons as well. So Small is a rapid way for you to make stuff that looks nice. And if you look at the bottom left, that's just one of the examples of their table classes that actually changes on hover. So it highlights each section. And another thing you might not have known is the right side. So all those icons there, generally those icons would cost you about $60 to get if you were to buy it directly. They're called glyph icon halflinks. But the developer was so generous to offer that to the Bootstrap users for free. So you get about 250 icons for free if you use Bootstrap. If you don't, then you kind of have to pay for them yourselves. So yeah, so that's Bootstrap for you. And if we actually try to make our own little sort of application, so if you open up Visual Studio Code, okay, so at the very start, right, just find a folder that you want to keep this project in, right? So make sure it's not on your desktop or on your C program files, or, try to make it a place that, won't have any permission errors. So I'll put it, for me, right, I'll put mine in a test folder on my desktop, right? So I've opened my Visual Studio Code sort of like in a test folder, right? So it's in a folder. It's an empty folder right now. Nothing has been set up yet, right? And what I'll do, right, is I'll Control tilde, or your equivalent. I'll open up the terminal. Yep. Or you can go on View and click on Integrated Terminal. Make sure you're on an updated version of Visual Studio Code before you begin, because it might have some problems if you are not. Then once that's done, right, so there's nothing in my actual directory at the moment. What I'll do is I'll type in npm init, right? So make sure it's all spelled correctly, npm space init, yeah? And you see that my folder has a capital there, right? NPM doesn't really want you to have capitals in your project names. So no capitals, no spaces, yeah? So I will rename it. I'll type in test, right? All lower caps, and I'll press enter. Now, all these other fields, I don't have to fill them up, right? So the stuff in circle is the sort of default that it'll put in, right? So I can just press enter all the way through, right? Don't have to touch anything else. So just press enter. Go on, press enter, and press enter. So the only thing I changed was I made sure that my actual project name was in lower caps, right? So you don't have to worry about filling up your license or your author names or any of that yet. All right, so just press enter all the way through. Any problems? Any questions? Sir? Okay, so the only thing I did at the top was I actually typed in npm init, so it was npm init. So if my folder was empty, there was no package.json, I typed in npm space init. And then for the actual project name, so the first thing that pops up, I make sure that it's all lower caps. So no capitals, no spaces, no fancy characters, just lower case. Any problems? Okay, so once that's done, right, so we have npm init our directory, right? So we have a package.json. Make sure you have that before we go on through, right? So now what we will do is actually install jQuery and Bootstrap using npm. Yes? Okay, so npm install, yeah, install, make sure everything's spelled correctly, and type in jQuery. But don't hit enter just yet. Make sure that you have this other parameter there, save. It's very important. That will actually make jQuery your dependency in your package.json, right? So -- save. Don't forget to put that. Yeah? Any questions? All right, sweet. So once you've actually hit that, right, you will then get a subfolder called node modules. If you don't have this, it means that there's a problem somewhere along the way. So if you don't have node modules right now, just raise your hand and one of us will come and help you. So if we actually have a look at node modules, right, you'll see that we actually have a jQuery subfolder. right, so after you've actually installed jQuery, right, we'll do the same, right, for Bootstrap. Right, so npm install Bootstrap, so make sure it's spelled correctly, right, and then make sure to save it as well, right, so that -- save, that will add it as a dependency, and that's what we want, right. All right. Okay, so now, if you actually open up your package.json, right, so we'll just check to make sure everything's all right. So open up your package.json. It should be in the same directory as your working directory, right? So package.json. You should see something similar to this, right? So you have your name at the top. Make sure it's all lowercase, right? And all this defaults here is fine. You don't have to worry about that. And then you should have under dependencies, Bootstrap and jQuery. If you don't have that, raise your hands. We'll now make a file, right? We'll now make a file. So you can right-click on here, right? And you can make a new file. Yes? And we'll call our file index.html. Right? No errors here, I'm assuming, I'm hoping. Yeah? Okay. So you should have a blank file called index.html, right? And it's not doing anything. And let's actually scaffold a bit more of our application, right? Let's add in a folder. So we make a new folder, right? So you right-click, new folder, and we'll make a JS folder. This is where our JavaScript logic will lie. Yep. And then we'll make a CSS folder. Yep. Okay, so you should have CSS as a folder, right, in your working directory. You should have JS as a folder. You should have node modules as a folder. You should have index.html as a file, right, and package.json as a file. And in your package.json, you should have Bootstrap and jQuery as dependencies. If you are on that stage, then congratulations. You followed my instructions. Yeah? Okay. So now, to save time, I will just, instead of me having to manually type, up the HTML, right? We'll just go to that. We'll just go to our sample HTML here, right? So we'll just copy and paste all that, right? And I'll just explain that later on. Although I'm guessing you guys are kind of tired of HTML. We already talked about it like a lot. So now you should have copied and pasted the HTML from the GitHub repository, right? So if you have done that, congratulations. Yeah? Now in our CSS folder, right? So now we are in our CSS folder. And we'll make a new file in our CSS folder, right? So you can right-click the CSS folder and click on new file, right? It should pop up under the CSS folder, not over it. Okay, and we'll call that file style.css. Yes? Okay. It should be a blank file, right? Nothing in there. And what we'll do the same sort of logic, right? We'll just copy and paste, because that's what we do as students, right? Copy and paste. All right. If you have any problems, make sure you raise your hand. Don't be shy. Don't be afraid. Okay, so in our style.css, we should get something like that, right? Yes? Okay. Who has reached this stage and they're okay with everything? Awesome. Great, great. Awesome. All right, so if you actually have a look at your style.css, you'll see that we have this sort of prefix here, like WebKit, like Moz, like O. Does anyone know what this does? This WebKit, Moz, O stuff. Anyone? Close. Basically what WebKit, Moz, and O do is that they target specific rendering engines, right? So with WebKit, right, is what I think Safari and Chrome uses, right? So if you wanted to change what Chrome and Safari and whatever WebKit-based browser would show, right? You can target it using this WebKit, right? Sort of like prefix. Not necessarily. It targets a specific type of rendering engine, right? So you say, okay, for you, Safari and Chrome, I want you to set it as this thing, right? So we could have changed this here to be something else, right? So then, like specifically, Chrome and Safari will show it in a different way, right? It's not necessarily about responsiveness, not really, right? So WebKit, what Chrome and Safari uses, well, Chrome uses Blink, which is a fork of WebKit, but it doesn't matter. Moz, right? Moz, you can tell by the name, it's something to do with Mozilla, probably, Mozilla Firefox. This targets the Gecko engine. So it's what Mozilla uses for the actual, I think they're moving on to Chromium now, but I'm not too sure. And O is for Opera. And I believe they use Presto, or they used to in the past. Now they're moving on to the whole Chromium thing as well, so yeah. So basically, you're able to target specific browsers with these sort of prefixes. This is, with your sort of CSS3, right? And it's compatible with most modern version of those browsers. Like if you have a really old one, you might not really be able to actually understand. So you would have that here as a sort of fallback, right? So you would have the general one there, right? So again, WebKit, Moz, you are targeting specific browsers, right? They just happen to be the same here, right? So they just happen to have the same sort of result. But if you wanted to change what one type of browser would show to another, you could target that here. So it's just something to think about. And we also have some other pods here for no repeat, center, and whatnot. It just makes sure that it doesn't tile and whatnot, right? And if you have time, you could look through all this, but I'm guessing we already covered CSS, so I won't go in depth, right? You can target specific elements here and their IDs, right? So you could say that it will have an H1 tag with an ID called app name, right? You could do that here. So in that sort of way, but we covered that, so you guys should be fine, right? All right. Okay, so that's for the style. And now we actually have to add some sort of functionality, right? But before we do that, let's actually go through the HTML. Not in depth, just trying to understand what's happening, right? So you see a container here, the class container, right? Class container, that will help make the entire content responsive, right? So Bootstrap has a class container as well. And in the background, using its CSS and JavaScript files, it'll automatically resize depending on what screen size is viewing that page, right? So that's the fancy stuff with container. You can then specify. So if let's say we had a div class and then we specified the actual column proportions, you could do that instead of having it as a general container, right? So you could do that. And you see that we have IDs everywhere, right? So we have IDs for the page container, we have IDs for the app name, we have IDs for this page header here, and we have this glyph icon. So that thing I mentioned earlier about paying $50-something, we get it for free with Bootstrap, which is great. So we have this button info. So if you recall, right, you had the success, you had the danger, the warning, and whatnot. We basically changed the sort of colors that will be displayed. Button info should display a sort of bluish color, right, as what we saw earlier on. So again, all this is just your general Bootstrap sort of classes, right? And again, this part is your standard HTML syntax. It will have a label that appears as a button. It's not really a button. And then in there, you have a sort of input field for a file, right? We'll showcase that later on. So the key thing to note here is that we have IDs everywhere. These IDs will be useful when using jQuery, right? Because generally, IDs are unique, whereas with classes, you can repeat those everywhere, right? So these IDs are great for us as we want to make specific sort of events or functions for specific elements in our DOM, right? So this is something to take note, right? Right now, we are just accessing the Bootstrap and jQuery dependencies directly, right? This is not really good practice, but just for you to sort of understand, right, you can actually just go straight up and reference node modules, right? So you say node modules, Bootstrap, distribution, CSS, Bootstrap, min.css. So that takes the minified version of that, right? But in later bootcamps, we might touch upon task runners like grunt or gulp that will automatically move those files and dependencies into the same sort of like, generalized folder. So you don't actually expose your, server structure, which is not really advisable. Yeah? But for now, we'll just do it this way, right? So we are calling in our Bootstrap. Notice the order, right? So what CSS stands for, I'm pretty sure you guys know, is cascading style sheets. So it overrides, right? So if you have, let's say, some conflicting sort of like, classes somewhere, right? And you want one specific one to win out, you generally want that to override the previous one, right? So your order does matter, but we have a really basic CSS file, so it's not too problematic. And we also call in our jQuery, the same sort of logic as we called in Bootstrap, right? So we are referencing the node modules directly. Future bootcamps will actually use task runners and other ways to do that. And we also are referencing a script that we have not yet created called basic.js, right? So you see that it looks into the JS folder, and it looks for that. So let's actually make that now, right? So if we go, so like right-click your JS folder and click New File, right? So it should try to like pop up under the JS subfolder. And we'll call that basic.js. So this is where our actual logic will lie, right? So you saw our index is just basically static. Nothing really is going on. Like it's not really doing anything. We have buttons there, yeah. We've got like file inputs, yes, but nothing really is happening, right? There is no real events happening, right? So what we'll do is we'll actually put that in our JavaScript file here, basic.js. So if you have made basic.js under your JS subfolder, so make sure it's under that, not in the same level as your index, yeah? And to save time, we'll just copy and paste what we prepared earlier, right? So we have all these good stuff right here, right? Just take all that and paste it in your basic.js, right? So you'll see that it's slightly different from what you did in the first section with Juan and Depeche, right? So this time we're actually not using document.getElementById, blah, 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 right? We're just using $signs, right? Dollar signs and a hashtag, right? And then we actually like put in the ID name there, right? And we assign that to a variable, right? One thing to note though, right? This is a jQuery object. So you can't start doing, inner, you can't start doing that. It won't work. It doesn't have that method, right? It's a jQuery object. It's not your actual element. If you wanted to get the element, you could instead like index the first thing there, and then you can do that afterwards, right? But we'll just work with the jQuery object. So you see that we're actually like selecting all these IDs that we had specified earlier on, and we're assigning them to variable names so that it's just easier for us to, write it down instead of having to select all the time, right? And we actually add events to them, right? So we want when something happens to that particular element, it should do something else, right? So for the image selector, so that's our file input, right? That's where our file would go. I'm guessing no one has problems, right? Is everyone on the right page? No problems, right? Okay, sweet. Image selector will be where our files go, right? But we have to specify what it should do when it gets a file, or like when there's some sort of change happening inside it, right? So we make an event listener here, and this is the sort of syntax you do with jQuery. So with your standard JavaScript, you do like dot add event listener and whatnot, but with jQuery, you can just put dot on, right? And then change. So like on change, it does that function, right? So just to make it easier for you guys to see what happens, right, we actually put a timeout in here so it actually takes some time to pretend like it's querying a server somewhere, right? So it does this function when there's a change to this particular element. Although it's not really an element now, it's a jQuery object, but something happens to that element, right? And we do the same for the refresh button. But there is no refresh button just yet. So if we were to, I'll show you later on. But yeah, so we create events for those jQuery objects, right? And this is the sort of syntax you do. It's less verbose than what you do in vanilla JavaScript. And if we move on, we actually have another function, right, that actually changes our DOM once, once the file has been uploaded and processed, right? It actually like repositions it and like changes the HTML, right? So you see this here, .html. Instead of having like .inner HTML, you can just put that. It's much straightforward. And instead of like doing .style, .whatnot, you can just do .css. Specify what part you want to change, and then specify the actual like value it should take. So it's much more straightforward, right? So if you're all on this step, congratulations. Now we can actually move on to seeing what it does, right? Because we don't really know. Well, you might maybe, but we don't really know. All right, so we go back to our terminal right here, right? So make sure it's in the same direction, right? And what we'll do is we'll actually use browser sync now. So we used browser sync earlier on for like really basic stuff, but now we'll actually run this sort of like, a bit more beefy setup. So again, browser sync, start, yeah, server, files, and we'll just have it watch all the files and their subdirectories. Yeah. So make sure you spell everything correctly. Browser sync, browser dash sync, yeah. And once you're ready for that, you can actually hit enter. It might take a while to actually go through all your files, but just be patient. So now we have our own little fancy web app thing happening, right? So this is a glyph icon, the ones that you'll pay a lot of money to get if you don't use Bootstrap, right? This is the name of our actual app there. So we have, let's just put it side by side so you can have a look. So in our HTML, right, we had our glyph icon here. So that's these headphones here, right? We had our title here. So that's the thing you see here, right? We had Moodify here. So that's what you see here. And the reason why it looks fancy is because of our CSS. So in our style.css, right, we specify that, hey, we want this background there, right? So it's an image. We want the body to have this sort of color. We want it to be transparent. We want the actual like header h1 tag to be this size, right? So all that is done in the style sheet. Yep. Sorry? Did you install it as a global module? Did you install it as a global module? So when you installed browser sync, did you put -G? Okay, just do it now. Just type npm install browser sync -G. It's not here, no, it's just for you. Hyphen. So like -G. So npm install browser sync -G. Because I don't think it was a global when you installed it, so because I can't find it. Browser sync. I just want to show up, y'all. All right, so does anyone get that website thing there? Does it look just like what mine looks? Sweet, awesome, thank you. All right, so we haven't actually done anything yet, right? So we just have this fancy-looking website that uses Bootstrap and jQuery, but we're not actually seeing jQuery in action. We see Bootstrap here, right? So all this like fancy blue color, but we're not actually seeing jQuery. So what we'll do is, if you note how we made these events here, right? So we made some events to happen here when we actually upload a file, right? So if we click on upload a picture of you, it pops up with this, right? And let's upload like a random file. You see that it actually changed the HTML and then it popped up with this, right? It changed the UI, right? It changed the DOM elements. Yes, that's what jQuery is good at, changing the DOM, right? Did you guys manage to get that going? Or should I go through that again? Again, all right, so if we go to the beginning, right, we had this. If we clicked on upload a picture of you, right, it should pop up with this sort of like window thing here. Yep. And then you can select any file that you want. We're not actually, so like any file, it doesn't matter right now. We just want to test the actual event listener is actually running, right? So any file, you see it changes there to say just a sec while we analyze your mood, and then it rearranges the actual DOM, right? That is what jQuery is doing right now. So all that logic we had in basic.js, so all this .onChange, so like when a change happens, it runs that function, right? So the function is it changes the, is everyone all right? No problems? No? Make sure to raise your hand if you have any problems. So we're on the right page. So the whole process of changing, right, was the functions that we made, right? And the whole rearranging the whole website was this change UI at the bottom here, right? So it ends up with your mood is, so it ends up as your mood is that, right? So this is just a placeholder for what will come up next, where we'll go in depth on this part, right? And we can, if you notice, right, there's another button that's showing that wasn't there before, right? So we only had one button at first, but now we actually have another song, please, right? So that was our button that we called refresh button here, right? When we started the actual application, it wasn't shown because it was hidden in the style sheet here. So if you go to the refresh button, the display was set to none, so it wasn't visible. But it was there in the actual like DOM, but you just couldn't see it. But jQuery, as it changes your UI, right, it actually makes it displayed. Yes? Oh, good. Followed so far, right? So now if we were to, let's say, look at the refresh button, right? So we have some event happening on it, right? So when we click the button, it pops up with an alert to say you click the button, right? So let's test that that event is actually being listened to, right? So we click that button, and we get a pop-up there that says you click the button. If we had time, I would have gone to showing you how to change this to Sweet Alert, so it looks prettier, fancier. But you could just use npm install Sweet Alert, and you could just reference that. So it's pretty straightforward. So has everyone reached this part so far? Yes? Good, good, good. Understanding what's kind of happening? Yes? Somewhat? Is there any specific part you want me to go over, or? Well, okay, well, everything's on the actual GitHub here, and it's all explained as well. So you just go through that. It should pop up. If not, just ask away on the Facebook group as well. Yeah? Yes? Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. You've been awesome. Thanks.